I can't tell you how many times I have gotten a little discouraged, perhaps by losing fruit to a disease on my fruit trees or seeing a crazy pest. Citrus leaf miners are one that comes to mind for me in my orchard. But there's a lot you can do to prevent them.
So I would say the first way that you can protect your fruit trees from diseases is by being meticulously clean. Good hygiene.
Bummer for me. Not my skill set. Well, hello, my friends. We are talking urban orchard keeping, orchard care. In this week of episodes, we have Susan Poizner on the show, who is an urban orchardist in Toronto, Canada, and the author of a title I really love here, Grow Fruit Trees Fast, as well as Growing Urban Orchards. So welcome to the show, Susan. So let's talk about, I guess, maybe how you got into this world and what your orchard looks like now. I know today we're talking also, though, about easy to grow fruit trees, just for someone starting out.
Okay, so citrus I can't talk much about just because it's too cold here for it, unless you grow it indoors in the winter, take it outdoors. So easiest to grow, hardest to grow. I would say the stone fruit trees are faster. They grow really fast. So cherry trees, they grow so fast. And they are pretty relatively easy. And you can choose pretty much any variety. You need to consider cross-pollination, of course. You have to make sure that, certain trees like sour cherry trees are usually self-pollinating. One tree is enough. You just have to check when you buy your tree that it is a self-pollinating tree. If you like sweet cherries, you might want to go for a sweet cherry tree, but it may need a partner tree in order to cross-pollinate and produce fruit. But saying that, I feel that cherry trees are easy. Either way, if you are going to grow cherry trees, my suggestion is learn what diseases and pests cherry trees get so you can protect it right from the start. Any fruit tree is relatively easy if you know what you're doing. And here's the thing that calmed me down when I was learning this stuff. Knowing that I just have to learn for every type of tree a limited number of diseases that they get. So with apples, maybe there's 5 common diseases that they get. If I can recognize them right away, often you can prune out the problem. You can find ways to deal with it. You can get disease-resistant trees. So do a little research in advance and that'll make your journey easier. So yeah, for easiest type, I would say some sort of cherry tree maybe.
Interesting. Yeah, that's one that I've not personally grown. And I've got a decent amount of stone fruit. I've nectarines and peaches at a minimum. Don't have a plum yet. Don't have a cherry. Do have one apple. I forgot if it's Dorset Golden or Anna, but those are sort of the two that do okay here. Obviously, a ton of citrus, like 15 types of citrus, 2 pomegranates. Getting more into berries. I did some in-ground raspberries and it just didn't do that well. So I'm going to try it again this year. But yeah, I mean, it's so context dependent based on where you live. Obviously, if you're in, the southwest of the USA or even Florida, citrus is a huge one. And the varieties of citrus you could do is almost endless. And then I think about cherry as a suggestion. I go, I wonder which cherry I could actually pull off down here. And I don't know, is there a variety you think I could pull off?
Well, and so that's the interesting thing. So we're talking about how you choose a fruit tree. I see it a little bit as a maze. You go step by step because first of all, you need to identify what is your climate zone, and you have to get a tree for your zone. So there's no point in you getting a tree that's great for my zone when I'm in a very cold climate. So when I teach how to choose a fruit tree and when I write about it in my book, I take it step by step. So first of all, you want to know it's for your climate zone. Then you want to know it's disease resistant if possible. And then you want to know about pollination. Does it need to be planted with a partner tree or does it not? And so how you go about doing this is you can bring my list from my book, Grow Fruit Trees Fast, and grab the catalog from your local fruit tree nursery. And then you can compare. You take the step by step, and you will find the perfect tree for your unique climate and conditions. So I have students from around the world, from as far as Australia or New Zealand or even India, believe it or not. And so they all go through the same system of just going through this something like 7 steps to identify the right tree for your unique location. So offhand, I can't tell you the perfect tree for you, but it would be very easy to find out that way.
When we talk pruning in the garden, I think in general, people get a little intimidated, but certainly with fruit trees, even more so because it feels so irreversible. Some of these pruning mistakes you might make.
Absolutely. So, first of all, if you're a person who doesn't want to spray your trees, you don't want to use toxic sprays, and lots of us don't, one of the best ways that you can keep your fruit tree healthy and productive without using sprays is actually by pruning your tree correctly. So I know for me, when I started growing fruit trees, I knew there was this thing called fruit tree pruning. I knew it was different from pruning native and ornamental trees, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the point was. And it is indeed very different. When you are pruning a fruit tree, you are actually removing healthy branches. So when I teach arborists fruit tree pruning, I remember I was in Virginia doing a demo. And this was before I actually did my talk explaining why you do what you do when you're pruning a fruit tree. So I go to make a cut to cut off an entire branch off this young tree. One arborist jumped and tried to physically stop me from pruning off this branch. Why are you pruning this branch? It's a healthy branch. So when you are pruning native and ornamental trees, you're usually focusing on dead, diseased, and damaged branches. If you remove a healthy branch, it's maybe because it's crisscrossing and rubbing up against another branch. So with fruit tree pruning, our goals are different. We want to ensure that there is really good air circulation inside the canopy. And why is that beneficial? Because diseases, like disease spores, they love dark, damp, moist conditions. So if you've got one of those hairy trees, like a hairy apple tree with a million branches, and then once it leaves out, when rain gets into the canopy, it never dries out. And so that is the ideal condition for rust and other diseases that are really common with apple trees. So we're trying to create a structure for our tree where there's lots of great air circulation. We're also trying to create a situation where each and every branch has equal access to sunshine. So the reason there is we want the fruit to ripen properly and to be beautiful and delicious. And so by making sure every branch has access to sunshine, well then all the fruits will actually ripen correctly and properly. The other thing is energy. So let's say, Kevin, you wake up in the morning and you've got lots of plans. You want to run a marathon. You want to move to a different, property to move all your stuff. You want to cook 3 meals. And for the freezer, there's so much you want to do and you're going to do it all in one day. My bet is out of all those projects, you're not going to do very well with any of them because you just don't have the physical energy. With fruit trees, it's very similar. We need to tell our fruit tree where to put the energy. Because if it's going to put all its energy into growing a million branches and growing fruit, well then the fruit might be okay, or it might be kind of hard and small because the tree just doesn't have enough energy to put into sort of building quality fruit on those branches. By removing some of the branches, you're telling the tree, hey tree, in the remaining branches, you can use the energy that you have in your root system. You can divide it up to fewer branches and fewer pieces of fruit so that each fruit will be more tasty and sweet and delicious and get more of the nutrition.
It makes complete sense. I think I was really kind of scared to prune, and now I'm 3 years in maybe on most of my trees, and I've seen the results of my confronting those fears, I suppose, and it's been great. And so, don't be afraid as long as you're using the right principles, of course. Would you recommend a particular time of year to be pruning trees? Does it depend on the tree itself?
Absolutely. So it actually depends on what goals you want to achieve. Okay, so here with us, there is a big difference between what happens everywhere. You've got a dormant season, okay? But for us, it's a really cold dormant season. So with a tree like an apple tree or a cherry tree or whatever, they are dormant in the winter. And at that time, they're not really actively growing very much. There's not going to be leaves on the branches, and they're going to store energy in their root system. So all that energy is in the root system. Think of it as a big pantry with lots of yummy, sweet stuff in there. In the spring, all that energy will come up into the branches of the tree and it'll pop open buds and the leaves will form and fruit will form. Now, if in the spring your tree has 100 branches, then that limited amount of energy goes out to 100 branches. But if before the spring comes, you remove, let's say 25% of the branches, there's only 75 branches left. Each branch will get a bigger share of the energy from the root system. So it will grow longer, branches will be stronger, and they'll have more energy to put into your fruit on the tree. So, saying that, if you want a small tree, like a small apple tree, to grow faster, you want to prune in the late winter, early spring. That's what you want to do. You want to tell the tree, hey, take this finite amount of energy and put it into fewer branches. But if you have a big old tree, big old apple tree, big old cherry tree, plum, whatever it is, and it is already way too big, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, every time I prune this tree, it gets even bigger and I can't harvest half of this stuff. And how do I spray it? If I'm going to use a holistic spray, what do I do? So you want to slow down growth. You use the same principle. What you do is, again, in the dormant season, again, all that the nutrition is in the root system. Let that nutrition come up into the 100 branches. Let each branch grow a little bit. Let all the buds open, even let baby fruit form. Why not? Let your tree run a marathon. And then, when it's tired, cut off some of the branches strategically in the correct way. And you're basically throwing away some of the energy, right? But it's telling the tree, yeah, you don't have to compensate by growing even more now. It's thrown away that energy. It's been like a kid who just ate a chocolate bar and ran around in circles. It just has no energy left to grow more and be taller. So if you want to slow down growth, you will prune in maybe after blossom time. Depends what the tree is, what kind of tree it is. But you probably don't want to prune later than midsummer. After that, it's not really advisable for various reasons, especially people in cold climates, because pruning does always spur some growth, and you don't want baby shoots to be on your tree in the winter when they could freeze and die.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes complete sense. Would you say, general rule of thumb, I guess, are there different methods that apply to different categories of fruit trees? I know the answer, but I'm sort of setting up.
Well, it depends, right? So here's the thing. When I first started to try and figure out fruit tree pruning, and it took me 3 years to just figure it out, I paid for people to come in from our fruit growing region to teach me and the other volunteers in the group. And every year I'm like, oh my God, what is this all about? Like, what? I don't get it, until finally I did get it. And then I could teach it because I got it. And it's like, oh, I figured it out. It's 5 steps. It's okay. But so at first I was taught one technique, which is called the central leader technique. And the orchardist that taught me, he said, you can use this for everything. You can use it for apple trees, for pear trees, for cherry trees, apricot trees, anything. It's a strategy that teaches you to make your tree look almost like a Christmas tree with one central leader. So with the tallest, straight up and down branch. And then the canopy, the branches go out from there in a sort of tent or, triangle shape. So you can do anything that way. However, some trees seem to want to be in a more vase shape. And I've found that myself. So our cherry trees like to be in an open canopy or vase shape, some of them. And some of the plums do too. So some people, instead of having that straight up and down branch, they make their tree look a little like a cup so that the center of the tree is open. Either way, the goal is the same. You want good air circulation. You want to make sure that the wind can clean out the canopy, that the sun gets to every single branch. So I always start off by teaching central leader, because even if you're looking at an old tree that's been neglected, for 10, 20 years, as long as you understand the concept, you can create an open air circulation situation in any tree.
Makes sense. I can't tell you how many times I have gotten a little discouraged, perhaps by losing fruit to a disease on my fruit trees or seeing a crazy pest. Citrus leaf miners are one that comes to mind for me in my orchard. But there's a lot you can do to prevent them.
Okay, so when we chatted about pruning, I told you that pruning is one of the key ways you will prevent diseases in your tree, and I explained why. But there are so many other easy ways to do it. We don't have to sit by and be victims as we wait and watch our trees fall one by one to different disease problems. I was there. I did that. I nobody else has to do it now because I'm going to give you guys some hints as to how to avoid it. When we first planted our community orchard, I did not know what I was doing. The main thing that I learned is that every type of fruit has a limited, finite number of diseases that tree will get. It's limited. So if I can know what those diseases are, then I can prevent them. I can recognize them right away and nip them in the bud. Here's what happens though, and this is what I did. So the first challenge that I had was pear rust on pear trees, those orange spots that you get on pear trees. So we had
Yeah.
planted 3 pear trees in our community orchard. And the first year there were some orange spots, and I walked by and I thought, well, that must be normal. It must be normal. It'll go away on its own. The next year, there were more spots. By the third year, these young trees were so bedraggled. They were so unhappy because I just let that problem fester. So I would say the first way that you can protect your fruit trees from diseases is by being meticulously clean. Good
Man,
hygiene. So here's how
bummer
that
for
might
me.
look. Yeah.
Not my skill set.
Ah, well, there you go. Well, here, once you understand why you do things, it's so much easier because then it's okay doing them. It doesn't feel like a burden. But here's the why. Fungal diseases will come again and again from year to year. What happens is these fungal spores, they set up shop on the leaves of your tree. So let's say it's pear trellis rust or apple rust. In fact, 80% of all fruit tree diseases are fungal diseases. So a lot of them behave this way. They come into your orchard, maybe from another tree, and then the spores sort of settle in on your fruit tree's leaves. The leaves in the fall will fall to the ground, and the spots are still on the leaves, and the spores are still on the leaves. So your tree goes to sleep for the dormant season, and the spores also will overwinter in the soil. And in the spring, your tree gets lots of energy. And guess what? Those spores are back in action, multiplying, having a great time. And there will be twice as many or multiple times more spores the following year. How can we disrupt this cycle? It's so simple. Raking up all the diseased leaves in your garden meticulously in the fall, and you don't put them in your compost because the compost will also overwinter. You bag them up and you take them off the site. Here in Toronto, we have municipal pickup of leaf compost, like leaf waste. You put it in one of those bags, let the city take them away. Their compost piles are so huge and hot that they will kill that kind of pathogen, but your home compost will not. So that's the same thing with pests as well. So you've got wormy apples, let's say, or there is some, you've got cherry, little maggots in your cherries. Don't let the fallen fruit stay on the ground in the fall because everything just overwinters and comes back even stronger the following year. You rake it up, you take it away, and you start fresh the following year.
It's a really good lesson, I think, what you're sharing here, because you hear, and this is a refrain I hear from beginner gardeners, especially because advice comes from everywhere, right? And what we try to do at Epic, and it sounds like you as well, is we try to make you be a gardener, think like a gardener. Get the operating system in your brain so you understand. Because a lot of people will say, well, don't throw anything away in the fall. That's where everything is going to overwinter, all of your bugs and your this and your that, and your beneficials. Sure, true. But if you have a very acute fungal disease decimating your pear, you do have to just think in trade-offs, right? Like, okay, well, I'll lose these leaves. That's okay. There's plenty of other things on the property that aren't diseased and maybe are great habitat for those bugs. And so I think that was a really interesting lesson you shared in just thinking flexibly on what outcome do you want? You are crafting a landscape when you garden. You're not trying to replicate the natural environment perfectly. Um, so it's a fantastic point. For me, I did have an issue on I think it was my nectarine, and I did just sort of let the fruit go. And now it probably is a good time for me to go out and pick that up. Maybe toss it in the fire pit or something like that. Who knows? As long as it doesn't go into my compost, should be good.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because that brings up a similar thing. Sometimes the disease stuff doesn't fall to the ground, and I'm sure you must have seen this. What about fruit mummies? You ever see those little shriveled up little pieces of fruit mummies?
Oh yeah,
And they're
yeah, I
on your
like the name.
tree. And look, Kevin, everything I'm telling you about, I've made every mistake. I've done them all. I think it's hilarious when people call me an expert because,
Yeah,
for me, an expert is somebody who's been to university for 100 years and studied this. No, I've been to the University of Life. I've made all those mistakes so other people don't have to. And one of the mistakes I made is seeing those fruit mummies on our apricot trees and thinking, oh, that must be natural. Wow, interestingly, the following year, there's more fruit that's affected, and there's more canker, which is sort of like oozing, goopy sap that comes off the tree. It was all over the trees, whereas the year before, I just found one little bit. So, every pathogen, if you just keep that in mind, that you are protecting these trees like they are your children, and they kind of are, right? If your kid was, I don't know, in some room with a bunch of sick people, you'd say, hey, kid, come, let's go somewhere else, or let's wear a mask or whatever. So it's our job to protect the trees. And sometimes it's so easy.
yeah, yeah. Any thoughts you'd have on protecting from disease or pest? I mean, we've got the picking up debris. We have being meticulous. We have just selecting plants in general that perhaps don't fall prey to as many of the pests or diseases. Maybe something in the rootstock is offering some resistance, what have you. Is there anything uh, else that you would recommend that someone do? Maybe even a routine. I don't know if you do this, but like walking around and checking. Is there sort of a checking routine you go through?
Absolutely. So how do I explain this? There's something called integrated pest management. It's a terrible name for a very common sense approach to taking care of.
It really is a bad
It's a
name. Yeah.
terrible name. I mean, because it had that horrible name, I didn't want to learn about it for years because it's like, no, that's too fancy. I don't want to learn about it. It is so common sense. And essentially, I teach a whole course on IPM. It's essentially learning what are the pests and diseases that your tree has or other plants. It could be used on anything. What are the 4 or 5 basic approaches you can take? One of them can be things like pruning. One of them can be things like good hygiene. One of them can be sprays. Sometimes you need sprays. But all of this only works if you are inspecting your trees on a regular basis. So, what you said, Kevin, is exactly what it's all about. Cultivate a relationship with your tree. So many of us, we plant our tree and we just kind of want to forget about it and just come back when it's harvest time. But that doesn't really work. And you know what? Frankly, the joy is watching the changes in the tree. The joy is seeing as it goes from dormancy, as the blossoms open up, interacting with it as you prune it and watching the fruitlets grow. All through that whole process, there is so much joy, but there's also meticulous, keeping an eye on what's going on. Is there oozing goop on the branches? That's canker, and that's a problem that
Yeah.
needs to be acted upon. Sometimes you see problems in the fruit. You might want to pull off fruitlets that have already been infiltrated by insects, right? You might want to take those away, take them off the site again. So it's all about a relationship between you and the tree. So I would say that's a great strategy. Be curious.
I like it a lot, and it's the point you mentioned that I've found, I guess, a bit of peace in the gardening practice is a way I would put it. It for me, actually, really kind of weird. Like as I've grown as a person. My gardening has grown. I've opened up, I guess, maybe to more different experiences in life. I've noticed that the sort of resonance, I guess, of the experience is opening up for me. So I find sometimes I might have a lot of anxiety or something like that, and I find it very calming now in a true sense. Like I wasn't calm, and now I'm being calmed by going through these processes and noticing those changes, like you mentioned, like seeing the little buds, seeing the embryonic figs come out of the fig, and just watching that. And all the better if you can notice the problems that are going on along the way. So, that kind of speaks directly to becoming a gardener. You need that experience to draw your own conclusions out in your garden and realize what's going on. And we're talking a lot about disease and pests, but there's a whole world underneath the ground as well for fruit trees. I think this probably confuses quite a few people. When you think about spraying in the garden, it gets a bad rap, and honestly, sometimes for great reason, but that does not mean it is a vetoed activity for your entire gardening career. Holistic sprays. I'm actually unfamiliar with the term holistic sprays, so maybe we start there. What do we actually mean by that?
Oh, wow. Holistic sprays are amazing. Now, first of all, in terms of sprays in general, um, there are some sprays that you may or may not want to use on your tree that they can be organically accepted. There's certain dormant sprays that can be very helpful. But what they do, those traditional sprays are usually really, they're trying to directly protect your tree from pests. Like, for instance, dormant oil spray that you use in the winter is something that suffocates the overwintering insects that are hiding inside the cracks and crevices of your fruit tree. So sometimes, and I use dormant oil sprays every year on the trees. That's the only spray I really do. But there's a reason for it. Holistic sprays are different. The idea around a holistic spray, it's a spray that you can make at home. Out of, like, the simplest one would be just rainwater if possible, or regular water if you don't have rainwater, and a little bit of molasses. Or you can put in yogurt, or you can put in, I've got a whole article on my website all about the different combinations that you can put together for your holistic spray or your fruit tree spray. So here the idea is different. You're not trying to kill anything. What you're trying to do is you are trying to strengthen the tree's immunity. You're trying to strengthen your tree so it can fight off everything on its own. So the science behind it is fascinating. When I first heard about holistic sprays, they're also called sometimes regenerative sprays. Again, like pretty much everything else, I fought it tooth and nail in the beginning, and I'm thinking, okay, this is too complicated. This is too advanced for me. I don't understand. And if I don't understand it, I'm not going to do it. Until finally, I figured out what it's all about. So the goal of the holistic spray is to allow your tree to photosynthesize to its full potential. So most trees, you put them out, you plant them, you water them, and hopefully you feed them every year. We can talk about that in our next conversation. And the tree's leaves are green, and that, those leaves will photosynthesize. They will, turn sunshine into delicious nutrition that will then circulate around the tree and help the tree grow, and then go into the roots during the winter for storage and then come back again. So photosynthesis is great, but most fruit trees do not photosynthesize to their full potential. So by putting these sprays, by spraying very lightly the leaves of your fruit trees, the nutrition in the spray, these sugars that are in the spray, can actually get in through tiny, tiny pores in the leaves. They somehow, the energy is absorbed into the tree. Now, the major place that you feed your tree is the root system. That's where most of the nutrition comes in, but scientists have discovered that they can take a small amount of energy through their leaf system. But here's what's happened. Here is what happens. You spray the tree with a holistic spray, and I use molasses in mine and some other things. Within a couple of hours, you see that those leaves get greener. It's amazing that you see it. So it boosts photosynthesis. It's got this extra nutrition that it's going to use right away. So more sugars are circulating around the tree. But here's the secret. the more the tree photosynthesizes, it's not just that the tree gets stronger and it gets better fruit and it has more sugars to put in the fruit. No, because fruit trees are a little sloppy. And they put that all that sugars, it goes around the trees, but it also goes into the root systems. The root system also needs to grow. And it dumps a bunch of sugars into the soil. It just loses a bunch of these sugars. It's called exudates. So these exudates are released into the soil, and microbes in the soil, they're like, hey, this stuff is great. This tastes really good. And so all the microbes that are in the vicinity will start to be really happy because they're getting more and more exudates. So they are eating up the exudates, and then they're pooping, and then they're dying, and then they're doing the thing that they do, which is process nutrients in the soil, which then turning the nutrients into the soil into a plant accessible form that your tree can then take up other nutrients. So it's an exchange. You're building a partnership between the tree and the microbes in the soil. This is incredible because if you spray your fruit trees every, let's say, 7 to 10 days for maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, if you're meticulous about it, I don't think you have to do it in the winter. I wouldn't do it in the winter, but during the growing season. The idea is that at that point, the whole community of microbes in the soil will be so well established that it's feeding the tree so well. The community is happy. Those microbes are happy. The tree is happy. You might not need to spray anymore with your holistic sprays. And there have been studies that show, and on my podcast, I interviewed a fantastic scientist, entomologist about this. And he has shown that fruit trees and plants that are healthier are that are more resistant to insect pests. The pests they just don't want, they don't want to eat.
Why bother?
Why bother?
Yeah.
They're like bullies in the playground. They go for the weak ones. They're not going to go for the strong trees.
What's fascinating about what you're saying here is, you talk about the soil food web a lot, or you hear that a lot in the gardening world. And oftentimes what you hear is to improve that, you work at or below the soil level. You do not work above it, right? And you're sort of saying, and it seems like backed by science as well, effectively crafting a foliar spray, so on the leaf sort of spray with these materials that you've described, will then not only help, of course, the canopy, but also below the soil as well. And that whole process of the exudates, as you mentioned, which when I found out about that, I was like, oh, no wonder people talk about sort of the permaculture methodologies and the soil food web and the health, because what you eat, it's what you eat eats, right? And it's the same with animals, but also, of course, with plants. And what does your plant eat is what's in the soil. And so you need to cultivate the life that is delivering that to the plant's roots. And so could we break down really quickly, though, what would be a simple holistic spray recipe? You mentioned there's a lot of them. Is there sort of like an all-purpose that you'd recommend?
You know what? I can give you the link to share on my website. So here's the thing. Your recipe may, first of all, as I said, you could take a pressure sprayer and just put in a teaspoon of, or a tablespoon, even if it's a big pressure sprayer, of molasses, and you've got a spray. You can even just start with that. The one thing that you want to be careful about is if your tree has some sort of fungal disease, that could be feeding the fungal disease, like the spores.
Sure.
So you always have to, like we were talking about before, you always have to watch how does your tree respond and take it from there. And in the blog post I will share with you, I talk about, the different things depending on what's happening with your tree. If you do have a fungal problem on your tree, you may want to use something like yogurt, which might sort of battle with the bad spores. You know what I mean? So there's different things that you can add. You can also put in fish essence of some sort. You can put in all sorts of things. And here's a fun one. And this I learned from the wonderful John Kempf, who is an amazing man. And John Kempf says you can even use Coca-Cola. just very diluted. The tree will love the sugar. So again,
You're giving me some very interesting ideas for our YouTube channel to try. I
yes,
sprayed my plants with Coca-Cola,
yes.
see what happens.
Just make sure it's
Very
very
interesting.
diluted, please. Otherwise, you're going to be very
Sure.
mad at me for sharing that information.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share that blog post with you because I go through a number of different things and the proportion that you would put it in, in your spray. But it's
Great.
trial
Great.
and error and have some fun. And like pruning, it's a way that you interact with your tree. You get to know your tree. How does it responding? Does it like this spray? Does it not like this spray? And part of what you want to do, if you can, is take notes. You may have
Mhm.
7 trees and they all respond differently. So you may have your garden calendar or your garden, IPM charts that you keep and just see, okay, well, this worked on this tree. This did not work on the other one.
When I bought my house 3-ish years ago, I knew I wanted an orchard, but I was scared of the soil that I had in the ground. I didn't really, to be honest, to even do a soil test. Kind of a clown move, but whatever. That's the way that I played it. Turns out I've got decent soil. I got a little bit lucky. But even then, when I was planning out the orchard, I was very curious. Okay, well, what's the best soil for nectarines? What's the best soil for citrus? What's the best soil for pomegranates? Was that a fear maybe you had at the beginning, Susan?
Oh my gosh. Kevin, you're assuming I knew anything when I started off.
Yeah, well, hey.
Yeah, make no assumptions. So, actually, when we did plant our orchard in the public park, they did do some soil testing. So, the park supervisor I was working with, a wonderful man, he said, we have to test the soil. And they were doing soil toxin testing. And so, they wanted to make sure that these trees would not produce fruit that poisoned people. Now, interestingly, later I discovered that even if you did plant a fruit tree in toxic soil with heavy metals, I'm not sure how well the tree would do, but they have done studies, and the studies say that somehow the tree cleans it up and the fruit is fine. If you're growing your fruit in an area where there's a lot of air pollution, you might want to wash that fruit. But, anyways, ultimately, you do, however, want to grow your fruit trees in healthy soil. So there's the one test is the soil toxin test, and another test is soil fertility test because you're putting your tree in the soil. If there's not enough nutrients in the soil for the tree, it cannot just pick up and go somewhere else and walk with its little root system somewhere else and plant itself elsewhere. It's stuck there. So it is a great idea, if possible, to test your soil to just make sure everything's in balance. When you do a soil test, you find a local lab, they'll tell you how to do it. But what's very important is you tell them what you want to grow there. And they'll make recommendations and they'll just make sure you have what you need. But let's say you put your tree in the ground, you're assuming your soil is good. Your fruit tree needs to be fed anyways, once a year, at least. Okay. What it doesn't need is those bottles of fertilizer or the spikes and all that stuff that you get from the garden center. That's one of my pet peeves because my garden and your garden are very different. And even if you live next door, your garden may be very different than mine. Maybe you did a lot of good things in the soil, and and I just neglect my garden. Every garden is different. So how can somebody come along and say, oh, this is a good fruit tree fertilizer? It doesn't know what you have and what you don't have, and you don't want to add more of a nutrient than you need because that can be toxic for the soil. So let's take those bottles and throw them away, and let's not use those fertilizers. The best thing you can do for your tree is to mulch it every spring in the early spring with a layer of really good quality compost, homemade if possible. Okay, but if you have to buy it from the garden center, buy it from the garden center. Why in the spring? So here's the deal. Again, if you, Kevin, wanted to run a marathon tomorrow, you might make sure you're going to eat really well today so you have lots of nutrition, so you got a lot of zip tomorrow. The marathon for our fruit trees is the spring. That's when they really need to, especially, trees like apple trees, cherry trees, they're dormant in the winter. And then they need to open their buds. They need to form shoots. They need to unfurl leaves and create fruit. That is a lot of work and they need energy. They will start off by using the energy that they've stored in their roots over the winter. That's what they'll start in the early spring. They'll bring up that energy and they'll use it to open those buds. But what happens then? Well, they need energy. So if in the early spring you have put down some quality compost, by later in the spring that will have partially decomposed and start to feed, provide more nutrients in the soil. Now, it's a bit of a complex situation because those nutrients, in order to get into the tree, you need healthy microbial population in order to, break down those nutrients. But let's assume you've got those little microbes in the soil.
Yep. Holistic spray regimen could help.
That's what we talked about. So exactly. So that's part of the preparation. So so every year you want to put, let's say, 2 inches of compost in a circle, like a donut shape, around the roots of the tree. Now, this is the interesting part. People sometimes mulch their trees and they'll do a mulch circle that's maybe 3 feet around the tree, right? And they think that's great. The only problem is the feeder roots, those roots, the young little roots that take in nutrients, are not anywhere near the trunk. They are out at the outer edge of the canopy under the drip line. And as we know, the drip line goes out every year further and further. So in our orchard, we have very big mulch circles. We pull back the grass and we mulch right as much as possible up to the edge of the canopy to make sure that the nutrient gets there. One other caveat: don't put the mulch, don't pile it up against the trunk of the tree. A lot of people do that. It's called volcano mulching. And it's very sad because not only is it not beneficial to the tree because it's so far away from the actual roots that take in the nutrients, but also you can be rotting the wood on the trunk of your tree. It's a great, pests, boring insects can get in there and get into your tree. So you want to leave.
You're making a lot of bad events easy to happen.
Exactly. So when you're doing your donut shape, just make sure that it's at least 6 inches away from the trunk of the tree where you'll have no mulch at all.
Yeah. And I was going to say, for those listening who, you hear drip line, you hear canopy, the drip line is basically that very edge, that sort of circumference edge of the canopy where that water will be falling. And, it's very interesting the way that you describe it, because I think people think all roots grow roughly the same, depending on the plant, kind of just straight down and maybe a little bit out. But when you look at some trees, I don't know how true it is for every variety or cultivar fruit tree, but it's certainly many of them. You're totally right. I mean, where you're getting a lot of that nutrition is at that surface layer, just as far out as those guys can go. So it's a very interesting idea. You've given me a process I'd like to initiate maybe in the spring, because I actually, my orchard is more or less fed by a gray water system. And so we actually have to pull that mulch back and dig it out and make sure that it's all aligned still, that the water's flowing through the system. So it's a really good time to peel the mulch back in general. And so I actually will change the way that I apply the compost and then reapply the mulch. And it'll be sort of this long mound, almost like a industrial composting style system. And I'll see what happens there, because I knew that, but I didn't connect my knowledge of that to the application of the practice. So I would more or less kind of be within that drip line and not kind of extend it out, which really smart. I didn't think about it that way.
Good. I'm so glad that's helpful. So that's the basic. You don't have to worry about your bottles of stuff, your expensive stuff. At that point, I do. Hopefully you have done a soil test at some point, the new growers will. But for us, mostly just mulching is the main way we feed our trees, plus holistic sprays. If you're doing the holistic sprays, your trees are going to be happy, and happier trees are more productive. They are going to be less likely to get sick, and it's just a win-win.
Well, awesome. I mean, it's been a great week chatting orchards with you. I'd love to do it more. I feel like it's a game. It's a world of gardening that you almost can't really get good at even after a lifetime. And so why not learn from people who are doing other things, right? So it's been great having you on. You have a couple books out, but you've got some other stuff going on. Do you mind sharing that, Susan?
Absolutely. I have my website, orchardpeople.com. I have loads of articles, and you'll find articles on mulching, the best types of fruit tree mulches. There's lots of different options. Articles on holistic sprays, articles you could put just spray in the search bar on custom sprays, that John Kemp style. So that's at orchardpeople.com. And you can also find my podcast. I do a monthly podcast and I interview experts like you, Kevin, who on specific topics, but all around different fruit trees, perennial crops. And so maybe I'll get you to talk about citrus on my show. That would be really
Hey,
fun.
as you called me an expert, I did internally cringe because I feel the same as you. Yeah, how could you be, right? That being said, we have learned some interesting things about citrus. So maybe you'll see me over on Susan's podcast. It's been great having you on, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.